driving me crazy because 6 weeks ago or more, I applied, and they're screwing up. I'm screwing up too. It's getting to be a real question whether I'm going to get it in case they need it for voting. So if anybody knows anything about a government agency where I can get this settled once and for all so they don't get bounced out of here, give me some advice, okay? Because I really would like to be able to settle back on something. And yeah, it's not exactly a sorrow, but it's a pain in the neck. Thank you. That's right. He was born in Panama on the Canal Zone as well.
Yeah, and he found out he was a natural born citizen or not.
Exactly.
And society clearly he was.
Yeah.
So the issue's been resolved, as you say.
Yeah, he was an important guy. Me, not so important.
Yeah, State Department.
State Department. That's what I thought. Thank you.
Well, my joy, a couple things. One is that Eden and her friend are in the kids' room by themselves this morning. Cards for people at the Lancashire. Lovely, for lots of reasons. And Thea is still there, so she'll get one card. But I think that's super sweet. And I wanted to express my appreciation for people making food. I had some amazing food by Eric, Donna, and Kelly, which charged me while I'm helping Thea. And my final joy about that is that we've been able to have, Thea and I have been able to have some lovely, intense conversations about life and death and gratitude and regret. And it's pretty powerful. I thought the best way for death would be that someone passes gently in their sleep. But these conversations seem really important for the person who's dying as well as their family. So grateful for all of that and all of you.
Good morning. I have a tremendous joy. Gabriel Stoy arrived in California in one piece. He left Thursday and arrived there yesterday. A little too fast for my liking, but he's there in one piece, and that will be his base now. In April, he heads to Australia, and then he'll return in 6 months. And I'm just really grateful that we talked a lot, many hours on the phone to keep him awake and keep him all that. Although when he got to California, he couldn't talk to anybody because he had to be so focused. He said, I've never seen drivers like this.
I had a couple of joys this morning. One, I spent about a little over an hour talking to Susan yesterday on the phone, catching up with what's going on in her life and what's going on in our congregation's life. She wanted everyone to know that she misses you and that she is doing fine. Her daughter is now back in her home. They have power, they have water, but it's not potable water, so they still have to have bottled water to drink. And the kids finally, their school opened this past Friday, so she's not doing this. And Jim is doing fine, he's back. The other joy I have, for those of you who have not been UUs for long, may not know about something called the Common Read. Each year, the UUA Association tags a book for everyone in UU to read at the same time, if they wish, and also they have associated workshop information to go on with it. And this year's Common Read is Our Authentic Selves, Celebrating Trans and Non-Binary People and Their Families. I hope that many of you will get that book and read it. Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to thank the other that have been helping with the food train and let you know that Don Lowry had a pacemaker implanted Friday morning, and would also like to have the benefit of the food train. So I've got a sign-up sheet out in the foyer if anyone would like to help with the food train for him or for Eva. Then you just sign up and let me know if you want to be contacted by phone or email. Thank you.
I have some technology updates. Getting all the kinks out of the audio system. Had a little bit of distortion last week. Sorry, Helen. But Helen's YouTube video broke the bank. We've been averaging about 15 to 20 views. She got 100. So beautiful, great topic, or she's got popularity out. Most of it was from outside the EU. And I'm going to be, we were having some trouble with the Zoom video. I've got YouTube Live ready to go. It's crystal clear. I can hear the music and everything. So we're going to start that next week, but I want to announce it to everybody in Connections this week. May we remember those who have spoken, those who have named, and those we have in silence in our hearts. I put this piece of sea glass in the water to represent all the unspoken joys and concerns. Tom's going to come up for a reading, but most of you know that Tom Parrish is a retired U.S. Marine Colonel. What you may not know is he has a BA in Political Science at Randolph-Macon College and a Master of Art in International Relationships from the University of Southern California program in London. He took classes at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, London School of Economics, and King's College. He has passion for history, especially European history, and he served in Vietnam, Korea, Japan, and through Europe. His beautiful, loving, and undeserving suffering companion for the last 61 years, Tom wrote that, not me, Elaine shared the support of his Marine Corps career. Their favorite duty station was London, UK, for 3 years, which allowed them to travel. Daughter Jillian, who was 10 when they returned to the U.S., and their son Preston. 2 grandchildren, Madeline and Quinn. Tom?
Yeah, I need that. I don't know whether it's the Chinese or the Turks, because Tom York used to talk about it, and he talked about everything. But there's a only veiled disappointment, I guess a word, that when you want to a good trip or what have you, and the Chinese had the saying that may you live in interesting times. All right, that has a double meaning, and we're going to be talking about the 16th century. And I don't think that there were ever any more interesting times, maybe up until the 21st century. It's a strange area when disagreement about sausages, when sausages can be eaten, leads a whole city to change religions. When a disagreement about whether the bread in the Eucharist should be leavened or unleavened causes riots and ministers to flee for their lives. An era where superstition gets 30,000 people burned at the stake in Germany alone. An era in which disagreement over the unity of God gets you burned at the stake. I picked this reading from the 16th century humanist Erasmus because I think it paints a picture of the era, but it sends us a message today that resonates. And he says, "May not a man be a Christian who cannot explain how the nativity of the Son differs from the procession of the Holy Spirit? If I believe in the Trinity and unity, I want no arguments. If I do not believe, I shall not be convinced by reason. The Son is peace, which can only be when the definitions are as few as possible and opinion is left free of many subjects. Our present problems are said to be waiting for the next ecumenical council. Better to let them wait till God."
Take a few minutes to use words and what life in the 16th century might have been. I'm going to read some words from called We Make It Possible from Jessica Lynn. I come in on Sunday feeling weary, having worn out the snooze button on my alarm clock. I come on Sunday feeling frightened, having seared my eyes reading the latest news. I come Sunday feeling burdened, having fretted about my workday and worries. But I leave Sunday service feeling refreshed, having reviewed the spirit of love in the community that exists here. I leave Sunday feeling whole, feeling lifted by the words of righteous challenge. I leave Sunday feeling energized, ready to continue the fight for peace and justice. This haven, this refuge, this place of worship, is because we make it so, with contributions, gifts of our time, our skills, our food, our love, our laughter, and our money. Please join me in giving so that we may continue and have a place that fortifies us in these trying and troubled times. Thank you. We'll be good stewards of your money. So a few weeks ago, I volunteered to had an effort to curate content and programming for adult religious education programs. In researching Unitarianism and Universalism through the Protestant Reformation age, I got lost in all the isms. When you read about this, from non-Tritarianism to Calvinism to a whole bunch. Needless to say, I was thrilled to learn that Tom, who's been studying this stuff and is pretty much an expert, will be sharing his passions and vast knowledge on the history of the era with the presentation today. Hopefully we'll make a nice entry into this. Calvin, the Rise of the West, how the Protestant Revolution and Calvinism contributed to the rise of the West and the shaping of the modern world, reflects his enjoyment of multi-disciplinary approach to history. In this instance, he's going to use a bit of theology, a bit of political theory, a bit of economic theory, and the foundation of international relations. Tom says the subject of this talk is more about the political and economic theory than the theology, understanding of supra and infralapsarianism, Pelagianism, Antinomianism, Arminianism, Prelapsarianism, considerations or familiarity with 14th to 17th century Heresiarch and Heresimach, while helpful, is not required. So without further ado, retired Marine Colonel Tom Parrish.
Thank you for the introduction. I disavow being an expert, but we will proceed anyhow. A little bit on came into this a number of years ago, I got wondering what it was that Europe and her offspring, the colonies, now the United States and all the English-speaking countries, how did they all of a sudden rise above the somewhat better established, more accomplished civilizations like the Chinese and the Islamic civilizations? So I started a reading program on that and came across some interesting books, and one of which I'd been meaning to read for a number of years was by Max Weber, the German sociologist, called Calvinism, the Protestant Revolution and Capitalism. I read through that and said, yeah, okay, I've got a basis here. So let me proceed. The Protestant Revolution was the seminal moment, I think, in the last history of the modern world. When on October the 31st, in 1517, Martin Luther tacked his 95 Theses on the door of All Saints Church in the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. I'm going to try to talk to how Calvin's work ethic and sanction of business and for the 16th century rise of bourgeoisism that catapulted the West into world dominance. The 16th century was pregnant with change. The Renaissance was growing north of the Alps. Switzerland had a democratic forms of government for about the last 150 years. The Dutch were chafing under Spanish rule. Commerce, banking, and financial practices were maturing. It was now possible to do business across the European continent without dragging cartloads of gold. You could get a writ from the Fuggers, and it was good in Amsterdam or Milan. The printing press, made it possible to spread ideas almost overnight. It was the equivalent of Al Gore's internet, only, all right? It was an age of discovery. I thought about this. You imagine, I think it would be equivalent to waking up tomorrow morning. If somehow we discovered life on Mars, we wouldn't be too surprised. But if we wake up tomorrow morning and somebody said, we just discovered there's a whole civilization down there a mile and a half down. Well, that was kind of akin to what they discovered. All of a sudden, you have this whole new world that we didn't know existed. So that discovery and colonization was important. And it added to the wealth of Europe. In 16th century alone, 180 tons of gold and 17,000 tons of silver made its way from the Indian mines to Europe. Lastly, the glue that held the Western civilization together for the last 1,500 years was losing its mucilage. In fact, it was rotting. The Catholic Church was wallowing in nepotism, simony, corruption, debauchery, political intrigue, and outright grifting. Look no further than the deplorable for a absolute bottom of the barrel. Debauchery, like at the banquet, Alexander VI is the epitome. The debauchery at the banquet of the chestnuts so disgusted his successor, Julius II, that he closed the the Borgia residence in the papal chambers for the next 200 years. And it was more pernicious than all of that. Europe was regulated, let me back up here a minute. In the Marine Corps, we used to say the Navy had three ranks, all right? There was admirals, there was captains, and all others. In the 16th century, there were three ranks. There was nobility, the clergy, and all others. All right. Calvin had a worldly background. His father, he was born in Picardy, France in 1509. He was a son of a lawyer. He was sent to Paris, where he had the sponsorship of a wealthy family, not his own, who put him through universities in Paris and in Orleans, where he studied Greek, Latin, philosophy. Humanism is important, and law, and was finally licensed to practice law. From about his conversion is around 1529. From 1532 on till about 1542, he was kind of like a fugitive itinerant preacher, from one city to the other, and where he was run out and then asked back in. And finally, in 1542, the Genevans said, "We made a mistake in 1532, we want you back." Luther poured gasoline on the smoldering embers of opposition to the Catholic Church when he wrote the 95 Theses. Because of his long disenchantment with the debauchery and degeneration of the Catholic Church, he'd actually made a visit to Rome and talked to the Pope and was absolutely disgusted by what he saw there. Nunnery, brothels, etc., etc. He felt compelled at that point, and he said, "Unto anders, I can't do otherwise." When Pope Leo sent John Tetzel north to raise funds for the Vatican restoration, to do that through the sale of indulgences. And if you don't remember what indulgences are, dispensation by which you could mitigate the time that you spent in purgatory paying for your sins before you got to heaven. And it was for sale. It made money. Johann Tetzel was the ultimate carny barker. He especially appealed to those, to the sentiments of the people. You know, we're going to save your mother from purgatory. So will you mortgage the farm to save her from purgatory? Oh yeah, obviously will. And his slogan was, as soon as a coin in the coffin rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Capitalism can't flourish in a feudal system, nor any system where class distinctions preclude the opportunity to move forward for improving one's status of life. Calvin preached that since it was only through the Word of God, as written in the Bible, that salvation was possible, no intermediary between individual and God was. The individual was as important in his own right and was as capable of understanding and making rational choices and of receiving salvation through grace as were the nobles, the royals, priests, and the Pope. In other words, every man and woman were equal. There were no societal, no important religious obstacles to improving your status. God approved and encouraged it. Moreover, he demanded it to proclaim his glory. Commerce and finance had been an anathema to the Catholic Church because it drew attention away from God, among other things. Roman Catholic dogma once held that a man who is a merchant can never please God. St. Thomas Aquinas said that making profit for gain, working for gain, was moral turpitude. And even Jesus acknowledged that the wealthy weren't going to do too well because it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than it is for a rich man to get to heaven. Scriptures were especially specific about usury, lending money, and as was the Catholic Church. And it was a sin for a long time until they finally borrowed so much money they had to acknowledge that, yeah, it's probably okay. But up till the 15th century, 16th century, it was still considered a sin. You couldn't lend money. Capitalism can't grow without lending and borrowing money. Capitalism, Max Weber, the German sociologist, said, is the pursuit of profit and forever renewed profit by means of rational capitalistic enterprise. Calvin understood this, he accepted this, and he made it a duty to God to enter into this. He said, what reason is there why income from business should not be larger than that from land owning? Whence did the merchant's profit come except from his own diligence and industry? If you read between the lines there, slam dunk against the nobility who was basically land rich. Predating and Wesley's famous comment about making money. Does everybody remember John Wesley's? John Wesley said, make all you can. This clear move away from landed nobility appealed to urban traders and businessmen who engaged in mechanics of capitalism and who depended on credit to conduct business. His early following was from urban people. Luther's, not so much. His was from the rural side. But make no mistakes, Calvin was adamant that you went into business to glorify God. Capital is used to pursue profit. It's not used to be spent lavishly or ostentatiously. You can make money, but basically you can't really use it. Profit was to be invested in further profit making. Spending on lavish lifestyles was a sin. Calvin put boundaries on lending, however. He said, one, it cannot exceed the maximum. I'm not sure who determined that, but Calvin. That loans must be made gratis to the poor, that the borrower must reap as much advantage as the lender, that excessive security must not be required. You can't be required to put up the family homestead for a loan of $100, for example, which was kind of the norm. And the last one I think is really interesting. He says, that which is venal on occasion is reprehensible as a practice. All right? So you can do it once in a while, just don't make a habit of it. And that no man may snatch gains at the expense of the others. The informists all agreed that good works are the result of faith and necessary evidence of true belief, though they don't earn salvation. Calvin was more explicit. Work ennobled the laborer, empowered the individual. Work was a sacred duty. It instilled responsibility and promoted social harmony. Work of any kind enjoyed divine sanction. And an arena in which man could glorify God. Calling. It wasn't just an economic means. Predating Marx by 300 years, he held that the success of capitalism ultimately rests on the organization of legally free workers making a profit. This resonated with the urban tradecraft and the workers, which again, his following came from the urban centers. And that was basically the motto of the Protestant Work Ethic Manifesto. The financial centers of Europe had gradually shifted north from Italy. If you recall, the Medici started banking in Florence, and the growth of the spice and the trade industry through northern Europe, Venice, and Florence. But Amsterdam and London, in large measure because the trade was moving down that way. More trade from the Baltic, trade through Germany from Venice, and these areas were growing. With Calvin encouraging business and while condemning unnecessary expenditures, capital looking for opportunity piled up. The Dutch genius getting everyone involved in the economy. Calvin stood steadfastly behind godly civil government and the rule of civil law. But he presaged Locke and Montague in stressing that if worldly rulers rise up against God, the church, being the body of the believers, had the right to judge that morality and take action to hold the rulers accountable. Against the divine right of kings. Luther, not so much. That's another story. In a book he called The Readings on the Prophet Daniel, that when kings disobey God, they actually abdicate their worldly power. The Dutch were chafing under Spanish rule during this era, and they saw this as sanction to take action. In 1579, they declared the Dutch Republic. I wasn't aware of that the Dutch had a republic as early as that. They began an 80-year war with Spain. Wars in the 16th and 17th century didn't begin and end overnight. They were long, drawn-out affairs. The Republic first with the force of righteousness. The it easy for the small investor with a few guilders to access the financial markets. They created limited liability companies to separate the protected personal assets while encouraging business. And an interesting note here, they also instituted or improved on something that the Italians had started earlier of municipal bonds. And they had three types of municipal bonds. One was kind of a bearer bond, they had an intermediary, and then they had a perpetual bond, all right? How perpetual were they? Well, in 1638, Elskin Jordesdokter invested 1,200 florins in a municipal bond, paying 6.5% interest. The Dutch were smart enough to negotiate it down to 2.5 later on. That bond sold in 1938 on the New York Stock Exchange and continued to pay interest until 1957. That was perpetual. Shunning lavish spending and available support. Shunning lavish spending, capital built up, and it was used in productive ways. Science grew. A lot of people mark the beginning of the science with Copernicus in the 16th century. You can name all the others that you can think of, and particularly Tycho Brahe and others. I mean, the 15th century saw not Van Dyck, but Hieronymus Bosch, for example, and many others. Education grew, and one of the things that the Calvinists pushed was education. If it was important, if you got your salvation through the Bible, you had to read the Bible. John Knox, who brought Calvinism to Scotland, took Scotland from being one of the most backward nations in Europe to one of the most, because he built schools and had students come. The sustained them through the 80 Years' War and a bunch of others during that period. 4 with the English, some with the Danes, some with the French, some with the Portuguese. They didn't default. In that same period, Charles V from Spain, who was receiving 20% of that 180 tons of gold and 20% of that 17,000 tons of silver in the 16th century alone, defaulted 14 times. But it was the joint stock companies that really brought the 16th century into the norm. The first of these was the Dutch East India Company. And I'm going to just refer to it as the VOC from here on out. And its counterpart, the English East India Company. They used their knowledge and what have you to build companies. The VOC and the EIC waged war against each other throughout the period. But the thing was that, particularly for the Dutch, the VOC was open to everybody who was a Dutch citizen. And any Dutch citizen could purchase shares in that company. The English, not so much. You had to have some money to buy in. But it was the beginning of what the 16th century equivalent to the space race was the spice race. Far East, pull all the spice you can out of there and make all the money you can. And they did. Unless you were an able-bodied seaman or a ship captain, and your chances of getting rich on a ship, on a voyage to the Far East was about 30%, which was pretty good. I mean, consider that buying a. The problem was the 60% meant you died, all right? And the Dutch East India Company ran through at least 4,000 sailors a year. Pretty dangerous business. Merchant ships were armed, and competitors, as well as the indigenous population, were subject to were fair game. The Dutch East India Company had 2,000 ships alone, more than England and France. These merchant ships were all armed. The Dutch East India Company was a precursor of an NGO, non-governmental organization. They could print money, they could declare war, they could establish colonies, and was really the Dutch East India Company that started the Dutch Empire, East India Company. They weren't as successful initially as the Dutch, but they picked up steam. And India fell into the crown of the empire because of the East India Company. It was in 1757 or thereabout that a guy named Robert Cleve fought a battle and really took over India. And the English East India Company ran India, not the British government, until 18. And the only reason that the British Empire took in 1857 was that the English East India Company, with their 260,000 soldiers, had kind of abused their power. And if you've and the Sepoy Rebellion, the Queen Elizabeth especially, Queen Victoria especially, was so outraged. Successors there said, take a back seat. By way of contrast to the Dutch and the English, take a look. I looked at what the French were doing in the 17th and 18th century. Has anybody ever heard of a French joint stock company like the Dutch East Indies and the English East? Well, there were. The initial one was sought to take advantage of the fur trade in Canada and the fishing industry, but they didn't last long because the Crown took them over quickly. All right. Remember, the Dutch and the English, they were operating as free enterprises. They were chartered by, they were monopolies chartered by the government, but they were independent. France, not so much. Louis XIV wasn't going to let anybody run anything that he couldn't run. Another part of that I think is important, that I failed to cover here in a minute. What else happened in France was, remember, Calvin was a Frenchman. The Huguenots were the French reformists. The Huguenots, like the Calvinists, were businessmen, they were tradesmen, they were craftsmen. The Edict of Nantes said, okay, it's okay to be a Huguenot. That wasn't okay with Catherine de' Medici, who was the Queen Mother, who orchestrated what was called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, in which she had 30,000 Huguenots killed. So what did the Huguenots do? They said, okay, we're out of here. We're taking our skills and we're going north. So what happened to France for the next years? They remained an agrarian society and they remained an absolute monarchy. The terrible part of the Reformation was the wars of the religious wars. The German 30-year war killed over 8 million people. The good part was they ended in what's called the Peace of Westphalia, which ended all those wars, and which many people say is the beginning of the modern sovereign state system and the modern international order. In summary, you didn't think I was going to get there, did you? In summary, Calvinism supported and encouraged a capitalistic system and laid the groundwork for liberal governments. The individual, it embraced with conditions, credit, commerce, and lending. It inspired a work ethic to glorify God, and it empowered the priesthood of the believers to take charge of their souls. What Calvin was sanctification of capital and financing and profit-free of condemnation, making labor equal with the bourgeoisie. And it didn't just absolve civil disobedience, it made it a duty to God. So, in closing, I'd like to say, as reactionary as it may sound, it is capitalism and its handmade liberalism that is still the differentiation between the West and the rest. Will capitalism, I'll throw this out, will capitalism and liberal democratic institutions survive? And how are they different from what Calvin? I don't think that Calvin would approve of Elon Musk, for example. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
One really important question, and also an observation, and a second less important question. The first important question is, where can I get one of those perpetual bonds? Okay, the second question is, do you think Calvin considered mercantilism? Because it, operated on a system of royal patents.
He did consider it a form of capitalism, because you're right. The joint stock companies did operate on national sponsorship. They were monopolies. But the daily conduct of business by small businessmen and what have you, he endorsed that, and I strongly endorse that. So I think that he did consider that, yeah, it was capital. That, I don't know, Dave, I really don't, but I think he did. I think he did. The joint stock companies were kind of one of those things that I don't think he foresaw.
Yeah, well, the obvious is the prohibition against loaning money and making interest is still part of Islamic doctrine.
That's right.
Today.
That's absolutely correct. And I asked somebody one time, then how do they do business? Well, it's very easy. You don't charge interest, you charge fees.
Yeah.
Very nice. Having been raised in Holland under Calvinism, it is still having an influence on me right now, because we were never allowed to boast how much money you have. You cannot never ask, what does your father do? Very a good thing. Boasting, not a Dutch thing. There also is a West Indies company.
That's right. There was a West Indies company from a Dutch West Indies company as well. You're right. Not as famous, but they were there.
I grew up there. So
oh, okay.
That's
So
all
you know that. Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was important. I would have brought it up.
Tom, that was really, really interesting and very, very educational. One thought I had about this was Calvin was very modern as far as economics and business and so forth. Really gives you a window into modern society. On the other hand, the theological side is just so cruel and exclusivist, exclusionary, to have predestination and have the elect, were chosen even before you're born. And also that the only route to wisdom, although you didn't have to go through the priest, you still had to go through the Bible, and the truth was in the Bible. So in a way, although he contributed to modernizing the world on the business economic side, it kind of lost a sort of a backward traditional theology that we're still sort of living with, I think. Is that,
oh, I agree. I agree completely on that. And I mean to bring this up with Sandy McElway one day, say, please explain how he sold it. Can you imagine going in and you're going to sell something to them, and you're going to sell something to the people, say, okay, start this game, you lost to start with, you won, now let's play the game. All right? And that's essentially what happened with about predestination. And I don't know how you sell that, but he obviously did. There were reactions against that. And it was a very cruel period. I mean, you know, Calvin, I don't think, you know, number one, you wouldn't have a beer with Calvin, but I don't think I'd like to sit down and talk to him.
I wonder if the business people just ignored that part. The whole idea.
I think you did so at your own peril, but I think they probably did.
I just thinking about that some time ago and concluded that what it was on the basis of an after-the-fact prediction, which means that if you were successful, you were obviously selected.
That's true.
If you were not, you obviously were not.
That's right.
So all you had to do to predict if you were going to heaven or hell is take a look at how you were doing in this life.
Yeah.
Which is an after-the-fact prediction.
Yeah, that's true. So even if you weren't going, you wanted to look like you were. I mean, that was part of it. Celine.
Moving away from business, I was always interested in the Huguenot story, but I don't remember it. How did the Huguenots fit into Calvinism, or was there any connection? And what was it about the Huguenots that so annoyed everybody else that they had to be extinguished?
Well, I mean, this area, it's kind of like any really great, you know, dear in history. It doesn't just happen in one place, you know. It's kind of an allopatric thing. It happens all over about the same time. Remember, Calvin was French, okay? And he came to the faith in France, and he fled from there. So while Switzerland became the focal point of Calvinism, it spread out everywhere. I mean, England, France, a little bit in Germany, Luther mainly in Germany, but and what particularly Medici was opposed to was that it was opposed to the Catholic Church. Catherine de Medici was Catholic, and anybody know what she really did for France? The greatest thing. She introduced them to Italian cooking, and from there you get French cuisine. True. But she was, because they were opposed to them. And Henry IV, I think, with the Edict of Nantes, Bartholomew said, okay, it's okay. It's okay. But remember, Calvin said divine right of kings is taboo. So when Louis XIV came in, remember the Edict of Nantes? Forget it. You're back on anathema. And in fact, after the St. Bartholomew's massacre, 60% of the Calvins fled, of the Huguenots fled.
Thank you. I've been fascinated by what they call the golden age of piracy, and I wonder how that plays into the thought that you were chosen or not long before whatever you did in life, because it would seem to me that some people would choose stuff, or the cruel stuff too, you know. Cool fun, but anyway, and not worry about it because they might have been chosen. Did that play into it?
I don't think that religion had any real play in it. But I will say this, that piracy, you know, we all think about the Caribbean and piracy. We all think about, you know, the pirates that we know and love and, you know, read about and what have you, and take Spanish gold and silver and what have you. But you want to talk about real piracy, it was in the East Indies. I mean, you know, if you were a VOC ship and you see an English there, fine, that's fair game. Oh, Spanish ship, that's fair game too. So you profited not only from bringing spices back, but you also brought prizes of war back. So it wasn't quite, I'm losing the word, letters of marque. They weren't quite letters of marque, but they were basically just the authority to go ahead and do that.
I just had to ask this. Would you say that the modern gospel of prosperity is a direct result of Calvinism?
Oh, I think absolutely.
Like if you're really wealthy, or if you're really good?
Well, I think that capitalism is a direct result of that. But do we have a perversion of what Calvin said? I mean, I throw that out there for you to consider. I mean, certainly, and I think that today, that they take that last admonition on loaning of what is venal on occasion is reprehensible as practice. And I think that's been perverted to what's practice is, you know, on occasion. And yeah, we've turned, and the other part of that is too, we don't have an equal society anymore. And I don't mean just black and white and what have you. I mean, there's an economic stratus there that you just send unless you got the wherewithal to do that. You got to be rich to get rich. So the two of them are a perversion we have in the 16th century. What are we going to do about it?
Thank you, Tom. That was very informative. Thank you.
One thing before I forget, two things really. The two songs we picked. Did you have to take a look at who who wrote them? Okay. And I wanted to pick two sides of the Reformation. I think this one pretty well does it. The other thing is, I'm just surprised that nobody asked about Servetus.
I was going to bring it up.
About the what?
Servetus, Michael Servetus. Servetus. Okay, turn to number 303 in your songbooks. We are the earth upright and proud. You might recognize the music. As we extinguish the flame of our chalice, we ignite it inside ourselves. Our commitment to our mission and to one another is unquenchable flame. Let us remember that we are not alone until we light this flame next time. Tom, you have some closing words?
No, I would just like to say that compare the words from the two tunes by Luther, okay? And I think you get kind of the progression of what's happened to the revolution.
Go now in peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.